In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarrett.
Well, I am joined here by the highly esteemed philosopher, scholar, king of sorts, Gary Habermas. Yeah. Gary, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be with you, Kurt.
All right, so let's talk about creeds in the New Testament. There is this strange little phenomenon in the text where, especially Pauline epistles, where you get Paul, it seems that he's saying something that he's passed along, a teaching,
he says that.
A wise saying, but sometimes people just sort of gloss over it. So talk to me about sort of these early creeds.
Here's the easiest way I think to jump into it. First, I'll make a bombastic statement. Of all the arguments for historicity, creeds may be the strongest one. In fact, if I would have to use one, now not one argument, but one like a genre for resurrection, I think I would take the creeds as a category. Now here's definition. Let's just say, I'm not going to debate the date, but let's say Jesus crucified 30 AD. Let's say the first New Testament book is 1 Thessalonians 50 AD, which is pretty standard.
Okay.
Easy, 30 to 50s, 20. And we, evangelicals, usually argue like this. You want to know what they did in the early church? Talk about Acts. Well, evangelicals say 60, critics say 85 on Acts. Oh, well, Mark's a little bit earlier at 70. Oh, well, evangelicals say 60, whatever. But they act like that's our earliest date. 60 to 75 for Mark and 65 to 85 for Luke. And that's the range from critics and evangelicals. And so they think, that's really early because Alexander's 300, almost 300 for the first source. And they're right, that's good. But what if we could get back to the doorstep of the cross? And so here's the way I present the creeds. The creeds are that we have, by definition, because they're in the books that are in the 50s, so they, by definition, start about 30 AD. A number of scholars say they're already starting up within weeks of the cross, and the majority of them, maybe all of them, are already around by 50. So it's a 20-year window from the cross on. So Mark's great at 40. Acts, even if you take a late date, is great at 55. How would you like 3? How would you like, oh no, I got a late date, 20. That's what the creeds do. And even conservative scholars can't ignore them, because as I said to one who years ago said, I don't like this creed stuff, it's sources behind sources. I go, look, every gospel has sources behind it. Luke says he's got sources behind it.
Yeah.
We know there's sources, and here's the bigger refutation, you mentioned it. Paul says twice, I gave you what I was given. And I call that an ancient footnote. Paul's telling you, this isn't mine. When does it come back? Well, one more comment, and then you can critique it or something. Bart Ehrman says that maybe all of these creeds, at least, and I'm putting parenthetically, at least a good number, but he says maybe all of them come from Jerusalem. Anybody in New Testament studies knows how a revolution that is. They may all have originated from Jerusalem, and they may have been in existence when Paul was on his way to Damascus.
Wow.
That's 30 to 33.
Yeah.
Oh, you go, I have a 33 crucifixion. We're not discussing that, but that's 33 to 36. I mean, this window,
Right.
I think Bart thinks most of them are 3 years. And that includes the Acts sermon summaries, which are a species. It's different. But the Acts sermon summaries are a species of creed, and Bart specifically dates them 1 to 2 years after the cross.
Yeah.
The Acts sermon summaries.
Yeah. There's a lot of explanatory notes needing to be said here. So many Christians, they need to realize that there is a time gap between the death and resurrection of Jesus and when the documents were written themselves. So you have 15, 20 plus years of the Christian church passing along this teaching.
40 if you go to Mark.
Yeah, so you've got this oral tradition, and sometimes scholars go a bit too far in their hypotheses about, the sources behind the sources or whatever.
Well, yeah.
But Paul says it explicitly.
And so does Luke. Luke 1, 1 to 4.
That's right, yeah. So you've got that material in existence in the text, and that's...
And critics admit it. I mean, people don't, this might be the most obscure one. We know about Q, not the document, but the verses that are already in Matthew.
So whether it's a document or a source, right?
It's irrelevant, but we're only talking about them as verses in the text are there. But here's one almost nobody knows, and the critics admit that Jesus somehow admits. John is probably based in part on a miracles document. And John has a list of miracles.
Yeah.
And you know that because he says the first miracle Jesus did was at Cana in Galilee. You might think, well, he's just giving a report. But later in the gospel he goes, and the second miracle
one.
was, and they think he had a source there. So this stuff's well established.
Yep. I like what you mentioned about the Acts speeches, because those are big, and sometimes, again, we need to remember there's no video camera recording what so-and-so said, and so...
What do you do when C.H. Dodd says, and he's not the only one, what about when C.H. Dodd popularizes this argument that there's Aramaic originals for most of those Acts sermon summaries?
Yeah.
Especially the one he says at Cornelius in Acts 10, Petrine. 1 through 5 and 10 are Petrine. 13 and maybe 17 in Acts sermon summaries are Pauline. So, hey, if I can say one other thing, I think a major objection someone's going to say is this. Are you kidding me? This is the best objection there is? I call it hearsay. Guys are talking and somebody makes this up, and it could have been somebody in an old Palestinian bar. For all we know, it was talk over the table. I go, hey, look, here's why it's important. It's not what you're saying. Paul goes up to Jerusalem 3 years later. He interviews Peter and James. He says, if you accept the pastorals in particular, whoever is writing those, some people think they use Paul's name because they're Pauline, but they're from the Pauline school. They're not Paul's.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
It says over and over and over and over. Here's a trustworthy saying. Observe the teachings of the elders. These things came from the big boys. They came from the ones in the beginning. Now, if James and Peter, by the way, the leading theory, the consensus New Testament view today is that creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul got, if not the creed itself, at least the content of the creed from the eyewitnesses. Now, these little stories in the bar are being told by eyewitnesses who are willing to go through their death, and those guys, both of those, all three of them, Paul, Peter, and James, brother of Jesus, we have first century sources for their martyrdom. So what I'm saying is, they're not messing around with this stuff. They're putting their life on the line. So since the sources are early and eyewitness and serious enough to be willing to die, that takes it out of the gossip range into the real serious testimony. And no other religion has this stuff. Certainly people hate it.
And the spread of the teaching of the church too goes beyond the canon of the New Testament. If we look, say, at the church fathers or the teachings of the apostles, the Didache, that has Q material in it.
Some people are dating that now in the last third of the first century.
Yeah. And I think it's Papias perhaps that cites quite a bit from material unique to Matthew. So there's belief that the Matthew tradition...
Unfortunately, only have his fragments.
Yeah.
But you have Papias. I've got a friend who did his master's thesis at a major school on the date for Papias should be moved back from 125 to 110. But you'll have for sure Clement at 95, Ignatius at 107, and Polycarp at 110. And you even Rudolf Bultmann, who, by the way, says these creeds go back to the earliest, he says the earliest church. But whenever you got Bultmann saying they go back to the earliest church, and he's a severe critic, he goes, and of course they were Hellenistic. When he can't deal with the force of the data, they become Hellenistic. And today that argument's thrown out totally.
Right.
But what I'm saying is even Bultmann, and Bultmann lists a creed in Ignatius as authoritative, 107. Bultmann does. So yeah, you're right, it goes beyond. You got at least those four guys.
Yep.
Ignatius, Polycarp, Clement, and Papias.
Yeah. And it may have been Ignatius I was thinking of for unique Matthew too. I'd have to go back and check.
Ignatius also says that when Jesus offered himself to the disciples, we only have the two women having touched the risen Jesus. The women holding him by the feet, and then don't cling to me, actually in the Greek is stop holding on to me. So the women had him in both places. The first trip to the tomb, third trip to the tomb, Mary. But never since the disciples touched him. Ignatius, just after the end of the canon, 7 years after what we often say, 100 AD, 7 years later, Ignatius said, I think he's quoting Luke 24, not positive, but he says, when Jesus put himself out there and said, touch me, they did. That's an Ignatius.
Yeah, yeah.
This is good stuff.
Yeah, it's a way of getting to the eyewitnesses and the material.
And early.
And very early. It's a way
There's
of dating
nothing like this in any other religion in the world where it's an early eyewitness combination. Nobody's on the block with the data.
Yeah, I mean, that close. You think, like, even with Islam, you're dealing with the disciples sort of recognizing and, what Muhammad was teaching. And that's decades later. But this is like, within, or as some say, within weeks of the events.
Well, hey, I can give you a list of guys that say within weeks. And they're big time. James D.G. Dunn says months. And since Jesus was crucified in the spring, it could have been the same year. Larry Hurtado, before he passed away, said the events happened days after, and they reported it immediately. So Larry Hurtado has days. Dunn has a few months. Bauckham is right in there with that same early time. And they're not the only one. A guy named Ware says this is the consensus view now, that it's all in that early period by the time Paul went to Jerusalem, +3.
Yeah.
And he's talking to the right guys. Paul knows how to do research. He knows how to footnote.
This, you really see this shift in the scholarship, even from the past, from the modern era, past 200, 150 years. It was all mythology. And now we're like, hey, wait a second. No, this is historical reportage that's going on, and we see it in the text.
You see, on a little slightly different topic, I saw a guy just the other day, a critic, going, well, some people say it's only this, but the provenance of who it comes from and blah, 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 makes this a new ballgame. And again, I emphasize, even if he didn't get the creed in Jerusalem +3, he got the content of the creed. How do you know? Well, because the whole book of Galatians is about the nature of the gospel. And in Galatians chapter 2, when he goes back 14 years later, which still predates 1 Thessalonians, when he goes back 14 years later, he specifically laid the gospel on the table. And Paul never defines the gospel where the death and resurrection are present.
Yep. So, Gary, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time. God bless you.
Oh, hey, great talk. Thanks for bringing out some good things.
Great. Thank you.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.